Hello everyone, welcome to a guide and overview of Fay Enchantress of Bretonnia. I played through the initial turns and have some conclusions on how this faction plays out. I will show its mechanics and some army compositions that I would play with later on. This is how I typically approach these campaigns, the conclusions before starting actually a campaign. So it should help you out in your own decision making. Now without further ado, let's play with the Fay Enchantress. So for our short victory condition, we need to complete the Throth of Virtue Vow with the Fay Enchantress. More on that later, but it's basically just a few quests. It's a very easy one. We also need to occupy, loot, razor, sack 30 different settlements. The reward for this is +3 hero capacity. Like I've said many times, it's only average for the Bretonnia because they only really have 2 types of heroes. But it is important to ensure you can have a few more without having too many buildings for it, as I've mentioned, of course. Now, long campaign. It requires you to achieve the short victory conditions, to occupy, loot, razor, sack 70 different settlements, to attain 10,000 chivalry, which for her it's kinda easy actually, and then to complete the final errantry war battle. Now, achieving this, you will get a +10 hero recruit rent, which is excellent. Of course, it will ensure your paladins are fit for combat and your damsels with good spells as you proceed into further domination goals. Now, it's a pretty lengthy one, but I believe it's even shorter than Luan, mostly because of a specific building that she has. You'll see there in a moment. But yeah, in terms of the Fay Enchantress, she's working in her lady's name, so her buffs are pretty easy. +5 peasant economy, +5 peasants available to the faction, and +15% casualty replenishment rate. It's a good, let's say, average buff. It's good for the early game, especially, which is typically the most difficult part of your game. So I guess that makes it good. Bretonnia does have a distinct lack of replenishment, so this assists as well. And going into that, the climate is a little bit, it's kind of bad, honestly. The only interesting part here, I'll show you with the climate stability. So you can see many areas in red. This whole area, it's like nightmare for Bretonnia, and all of this area, like everything in the old world, nothing is suitable. You can imagine in the new world, sorry, even the island there. The only good or average part is how magical forests are actually unpleasant instead of uninhabitable. Let me show you the differences there, basically. But yeah, that's the only good thing. Other than that, for the most part, it's really a hard campaign for you to dominate the whole map with. As it is typical for Bretonnia, your starting province is a 2-settlement province. It is very defensible, though, actually, since the Wood Elves actually have a pact with you for the time being, so this will allow you to, focus on other threats, maybe going after Grom there, maybe going downside and dealing with Mogor or with Skaven Blight, that sort of idea. Typical expansion should go still into dominating anything that you can from Bretonnia to have a solid base, and then you expand as your enemies refuel themselves. Maybe going into the south to deal with everyone here, maybe going into the greenskins areas, maybe going into cleansing the lands of the Empire if they are overrun by enemies. Whatever happens, I believe it's mostly due to how the game will proceed, other than you having, a conventional path of conquest. Okay, that's basically how I would take this campaign. Diplomatically, you're part of the Order Tide. High Elves, Empire, Wood Elves, Dwarfs are likely good friends. I mentioned the Wood Elves precisely because you do have an non-aggression pact and military access with them and good relations with them. So they have this as a good thing in the beginning. They won't have too many troubles going into Athaloran. Now, basically enemies will be greenskins for the beginning, beastmen later on, Skaven, some vampire counts maybe that they can find out into the north here, depending on how it goes, but later on it's really up to you. Now, good outposts, as I mentioned, will come in the form of the wood elves, of the high elves, of the dwarfs. Really depend on what you wish, but there's plenty of choices. Among their single entities, their missile troops, their good infantry units. Bretonnia only doesn't like cavalry. that's the one thing they're good at. They're good to provide it, and they're flyers, of course. So yeah, everything else really suits them, especially artillery from the dwarfs. It will just make the Bretonnia faction in such a different playstyle, you know. So these are the ones that I would recommend. So in terms of mechanics, I'll start differently this time and just show you the Green Knight. Basically a very tanky character. He's ethereal, he's armor piercing, he does frostbite and magical damage. So he's a good single entity that you can summon. I'll explain how later on, but it has to do with the chivalry. I can talk about it now. He has physical resistance, of course, Sacred Guardian, Unbreakable. Yeah, he's a tank. Basically, he's a nightmare for the enemy to get rid of, and of course looks cool because he's green. That's about it. So, in terms of chivalry, as we're saying, is a specific mechanic that you accumulate in order to generate campaign-wide buffs. So, extra Lord rank, minus corruption, recruit rank for Bretonnia Knight units, unit experience per turn, and then all lords starting with the questing vow. And also you can call upon that Green Knight that you saw limitless times. So it's leadership for all armies. It's really good. All of these are really cool, of course. So they will be growing up, you know, as the more chivalrous you are, the better. You also can have some basically just some minor buffs there with leadership +2. So yeah, be wary. Most of these are gained from you know, battles, from actually some trades, and there's a building here in Castle Carcassonne that also helps out a lot. Okay, now speaking of other mechanics, let's talk about the vows or throts. So basically what you do is you select missions, in essence. You have 3 options that are giving, you know, for instance, I chose to rank up 5 times after taking the pledge. So as she gains those 5 times, for 5 new skill points and levels, of course, then I'll be granted a Thought of Protection. Most of these are just upkeep reduction for some units, specifically for the, you know, the knights, basically, which is exactly what you wish. But you also gain some campaign movement range, as you see there, Winds of Magic, that the fact that the Lord will be wounded, this is extremely important, of course, and the Perfect Vigor attribute is really nice. So yeah, basically that's what you should. You assign the mission, don't forget to do that, assign a mission, you complete the mission, you get the vows, and then you jump to the next one, and then the next one, and your heroes will, your lords will improve, sorry. Now, in terms of the final mechanic here is the peasant economy. So basically, you can have only specific numbers of peasants in your armies, peasant units in your armies, without that hindering your farming economy. Basically, think of this as a draft mechanic. If you draft too many people, there aren't too many people to work the fields, so your economy suffers. Basically, that's the idea. You can check whether a unit is a peasant, okay, or a knight, by simply checking that icon there. It will also tell you whether it follows a Grail vow or another. Okay, so for instance, right now I am at maximum capacity, so basically 15 of possible 15 units. If I recruit any other units, you know, it will already tell me that there are too many peasants. So it's a good thing that we have this warning here when I'm trying to recruit stuff. So basically, yeah, that's what you should do. Do note that the field trebuchets, for instance, are considered peasants, so be wary of this when recruiting units, you know, of course, to ensure that you don't cross that, because if you do, you get just some reductions, basically, instead of having this upkeep and reductions there, you know, those buffs, you'll get issues, of course. Now, that's it in terms of the mechanic. Remember that the Fay Enchantress actually can support +5, so that's why you can support a few more units in the beginning, which is, it's great, just for you to rush perhaps some enemies nearby. Province edicts are fairly important for Bretonnia, as mentioned before. You have control and corruption, lots of control and corruption, research rate and construction costs. This is excellent. It's really good. Now, it's very rare that we have research rate, and the idea here is that, for instance, you can just select it when you want some research, and you can stop, the edicts once you realize that you've toned down a turn or another, so you can visually see the difference, So as soon as you do that, then you can go back to something else, because you'll see that the research has worked out perfectly. So the fact that you can pop it up, it's kind of like a mechanic from Civilization games, for instance, where you just pump up the slider for research. That's how you do it with Bretonnia, And also the construction costs. So, always excellent to have both in one. Then you have income from old buildings, pretty straightforward. Recruitment cost and local recruitment capacity. Note, it's +2, so it's much useful to spring larger armies faster. Most of these are actually just +1 for local recruitment. And of course you have the typical growth one. Overall they have very good ones. The growth is slightly underwhelming considering all the others, but still, it's really cool to have it at least, In terms of the army stances, pretty straightforward ones. So channeling, costing 10% move. Encamp, costing 50%, and immune to attrition and enemies replenishment, the typical ones. Raiding, costing 50% move, but note that it costs also -2 chivalry per turn. As well, the same thing with ambush. It costs chivalry per turn and campaign movement range penalty 25%. So, for some reason, ambushing and raiding is not chivalrous. So, yeah, but it's still a good tactical advantage. Just remember if you're raiding for tons of time in a single with an army, please just double check it. Maybe that's a source of you having reduced chivalry for no reason, so be wary of that. So Carcassonne has a unique building, the Tower of the Enchantress, that gives you quite some nice buffs. So Winds of Magic Power Reserve to all armies, Corruption faction-wide reduction, Hero Recruit rank for damsels, that's always nice, and Chivalry +50 per turn. This is the deal here. The Fay Enchantress can get a lot of chivalry just by building this tower, which you honestly typically always should. It's always very helpful in the long run. Now, in terms of military, require 5 military buildings to have access to your full military, but only 1 can truly be built in a minor settlement, which is the one from farming economy, basically. Even tier 3 units are rather useful, so you might have a shot, at focusing more on economy early on. It's up to you. Like questing knights and knights of the realm are already really powerful. You still have some halberds, some men at arms with pole arms. You have some battle pilgrims and grail relics, of course, and some damsels for having some spellcasting. So definitely you have some ideas here, even if these are not going to destroy Chosen, yeah, for sure, but of course at that point in the time, how many powerful armies are you facing, So you can still have some good combinations with that, focusing on economy, and then going for your your Grail Knights and your flying units, Hippogriffs and Royal Pegasus, of course. Even with the Foot Squires, you can go really well. The Blessed Field Trebuchets, it's always excellent. So. By all means, tier 3 not to be frowned upon. When I mention tier 3 is simply because, of course, to reach tier 4 it kind of requires a little bit more growth, as you can see there, so it may take a long time before you get there. So yeah, the early game, it's, let's say, up to tier 3, and they certainly have their uses. They have their units to overcome that. Now, one note on the armory: it does not unlock units, yes, but rather gives campaign buffs. Now, it includes armor to all units, which is really cool. I mean, 5 of these buildings, it's already 10 armor to all units, and +5 global recruitment capacity, so it's not bad at all. It's really cool, actually. So consider this. Infrastructure has the unique situation of splitting farming and industry, so they're quite mutually exclusive, basically, so be wary. Now, both of these have a secondary building, really. So for farms, this basically you get an income building, and then you get some more income from farms, growth and local recruitment capacity. And then we have the industry one, which gives less income, but then some campaign movement range, some attrition when under siege, local recruit capacity, and ammunition when under siege. So these are mutually exclusive, and you also have research that focuses on the income here and the income here. So be wary of that. Just be mindful of that and plan it out. You also have a slight income It only shows up in the fifth degree, basically the fifth tier there. And control, which also gives control in adjacent provinces. Nothing wrong with having one of these just to ensure, you know, especially on higher difficulties. And then you have the typical growth in casualty replenishment rate. Note that you have 2 growth buildings, which is excellent, plus the growth edict. You can actually get some good combinations there, you know. Now, research. Let's talk about research. It is divided into 4 parts. The first one is basically a confederation mechanic that allows you to have some more diplomatic relations, some chivalry, and enables the opportunity to confederate with specific factions. My advice would be to only research this if you see someone becoming really powerful, okay? And then you can research this to try and confederate with that specific faction, and that's it. You know, so not to focus all of them, but rather to just go, okay, I'm gonna go for trying to confederate with Corona as fast as possible because, you know, they're getting really big, or I want to focus Bordello because they're doing really great in Lustria. Then I'm gonna focus the research there, and that's it. 18 turns, I'll confederate them. So it's always a nice idea for you to think about. It also gives you some diplomatic relations with specific other factions, like the Dwarves, Empire, Kislev. So if you really wish some outpost units, it's really great. You know, all that you need to do is like, I want units from the Dwarves. I'll go here, you know, 6 turns, I'll have great relations with the Dwarves, and I'll just try to focus that into alliances, into outposts. That's what I would do, you know. In terms of the other secondary line, basically it is the other thing. So if this was for getting good relations with others, these are for getting buffs against some enemies. So if you're focusing mostly on fighting some specific enemies, then you can go here. For instance, I would like to plan out and going against the Skaven. Let me see where that is. Yeah, so I would go here. Okay, so getting some leadership when fighting against Skaven, less corruption, which always helps, of course, and yeah, that's the idea. That's how I would go, and of course the chivalry for every victory against them. That's a good thing that you get. Then we have the third part, which is basically economy and also unit buffs. So for the most part, over here we have more farming based, and over here we have more income based for industry, you know. So yeah, don't neglect this. The research rate plus 5% is also important. And of course you can see from the units there, from the icon there, you have some good buffs for knight units here and some buffs for peasant units here. So by all means, you know, these can quite increase a lot, so you'll get better units, of course, overall in the late game that you can actually use, you know. In terms of the skills, of course, they're always divided into the Lord specific, the yellow line or the caster or melee line, the red line or army, and the blue line or campaign. Now, starting with the blue line, nothing really important here. You know, some recruitment costs, some income from farms, but nothing like there's nothing with replenishment rate or upkeep costs here. So yeah, it's not one that I would focus. Maybe the gifted beginnings to have some hero capacity and recruit rank, but that's up to you. The red line is also very expensive, mostly because it splits up early infantry units with late infantry units, you know, and also the cavalry, it splits them up, so there's not real easy pickings here, you know. It also it changes, you know, from the peasant bowman and mounted yeoman with the artillery, so if these two were together, you know, plenty of other options would be available, so yeah, it's rather expensive. You'll see later on with the army compositions. Now, the Fay Enchantress in herself, she has some decent bonuses for Grail Knights and Grail Guardians, and of course for control, growth, corruption, as you can see there, as well as this word save for prophetesses, lords, and damsel heroes with 12 armies, which is always nice. But still, more honestly, she's buffing much more her army than actually the campaign. In truth, all truth be said, you know. Now, here are all the red line buffs for the Bretonnian forces. Noted, as I've mentioned before, the early game has a different skill set than the elite, let's say, infantry or cavalry units, you know. So, for the most part, it makes it difficult to choose some skills that we lack throughout the game properly. So, a disclaimer before on these armies, I like to try different compositions so that I get to use and see every unit in the game. Of course, if these are not working for you, just feel free to change them. I'm not ordering anything, you know. I don't tell him what to do. So Fay focuses on battle pilgrims and Grail knights with some buffs to Grail reliquies. Thus, some armies, including those units, are of course essential, as you can see here. One basically with some trebuchets, one with some missile troops, but in essence everything the same. Now, nothing wrong with you going full cavalry here, especially with the Fay Enchantress buffing a little bit of the Grail knights. So yeah, that's definitely a good idea. I would always give her maybe another caster as well, maybe a Heavens or Beasts caster as you prefer. And also a paladin to ensure that she's safe for the most part. Now, this is also up to you. You can use 2 paladins, you can use 3, you can use none. It's really up to you what you choose. I just typically choose, you know, a melee hero and a caster hero for all my armies, just as a ground base, you know. Then we have some different compositions. These are already that are recommended for Luan, for instance. Now, some infantry, some archers, some cavalry units. The numbers may diverge. Maybe you want 7 cavalry units, so maybe you just want a couple of archers. Maybe you just want 3 infantry units to suck up some missiles so that your cavalry can do the deal. Whatever you prefer. Typically, I like to use, you know, different sorts of combinations. Notice how they are. They range from quite effective with just cavalry units here to some expensive or average here. If you try to get too many types of units, you can see that the addition of artillery with the missiles, that's immediately raising a lot of red line skills that you need to waste. So yeah, at least to buff them. Nothing wrong with you having a couple of trebuchets and not even buffing them, but you know, it's up to you guys. For me, 3 units at least constitutes enough percentage of the army, let's say, for me to buff them with the red line skills. But that's my theory, that's my idea. Now, if you wish to have some time experimenting, this is more like a tier 3 army, let's say, just to you know, to engage in your early game. Nothing wrong with some questing knights and knights of the realm. They're really good units, especially in the beginning. Same thing here, you know, instead of having the archers, I would just went for the trebuchets, but it's up to you. This is more of a let's have some flying units, some infantry and some artillery. This is great for sieges, for instance, if you're facing someone that has a lot of walls, you know, if you're going into some place where they most likely have a lot of walls, you know, nothing wrong with using an army like this. And this one is another one based, of course, more on the prophetess, but with some flying units and just some archers and infantry support. Okay, but by all means, you can use all your different combinations. It's really up to you. These are just the ones that I would try out and then adapt during my playthrough, of course. So the Fay Enchantress actually feels more what the typical experience with Bretonnia should be. You know, focus on their Grail Knights, supported by magic, some weak infantry, and in a nice, kind of safeguarded position, you know. With the endgame possibilities of the different scenarios, I can foresee enjoying many hours of playing this campaign and with different results. As always, the replay value is limited on the lack of heroes that you can get and the lack of typical different lords that you can get. So, of course, this is quite limited. I would love for them to have some sort of a buff, some sort of a DLC as well, but for the time being it's still a nice campaign to try out. Now, in terms of army, it consists of average infantry, average missiles, great cavalry, great flying units. It does lack strong anti-large infantry and lacks single entities for the most part. Now, units will require buffs to be effective, either research or red line. Replenishment is average at best. Climate is a severe issue which hinders most of the campaign, by the ways, and any attempt to go on domination campaigns, so be wary of that. Still, I believe now it is time to play with Fay Enchantress.